Alrighty, thank you all for being here. My name is Diana Gamza, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance. Um, and this is, excuse me, I have to sneeze. It's not coming. This is the second part in our series of getting OCal certified to work directly with CCOF, a certifying agency for the OCal program, and all of the tips and tricks and everything you need to know along the way. And we are so grateful for our partnership and the support of CCOF throughout this process. At any time, please feel free to reach out directly to CCOF for some one-on-one support. That would be great. And we'll make sure that the contact information is in the chat. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. It is our hope that anyone who's interested in commercial cannabis will take time to tune into these webinars, educate themselves, and continue to become stewards of the environment and of the cannabis community. Our Get Legit series provides all sorts of free webinars on business skills, technical skills, compliance and regulatory training, and environmental stewardship classes to support our cannabis industry. And you can find all of our Get Legit webinars and links to register at www.nccannabisalliance.org/Get Legit. And we are the Nevada County Cannabis Alliance. We are a nonprofit trade association that represents the local cannabis industry here in Nevada County. And we serve the entire licensed cannabis community through our Get Legit free educational programming. Our mission is to support public policy initiatives through representative advocacy and provide educational opportunities for business growth and success that promote environmental stewardship. And just some upcoming webinars to pay attention to that will be coming up are on June 4th. We are very excited to have Bill Panzer, who is a legal director with Cal Normal, and he is going to be talking all about rescheduling, the impacts to small cannabis, to our small cannabis businesses. So we hope that you tune into that, and you can find out where to register for that free webinar in the chat. Today's webinar, I'm going to hand it over to our CCOF team to introduce themselves and to go into what we'll be getting into today. And for anybody that missed our first session for the OCal webinar series, we will link it in the chat, and also it's available on YouTube for free. But these are to be all the skills you need, all the trainings you need to get OCal certified this year. All right, hand it over to you, Marli and Vanessa.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Marli. I'm part of the applicant support team here at CCOF, and I'm joined with Vanessa. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself briefly, Vanessa.
Hey everyone, Vanessa, also with app support here at CCOF.
Great, thanks. So we are two of the folks on the applicant support team, and if you saw last week's meeting, Kim is the other member of our team who helped guide people through the new application process and getting started with the OCal certification. And if you didn't watch last week's session, highly recommend it. Kim gave a great overview of the organic certification, how OCal ties into that, and what the certification process is like for cannabis doing the OCal program. So that's a great starting point. And today will be more of an open forum for questions, and then we'll dive into some of the application forms to start getting into the details. So with that being said, do any of the folks who are on the meeting have questions already? If you've gotten a chance to start with your application and look it over, now's a great time for any initial questions about the process or the forms themselves. Just want to hold a little space for that before we dive into the application forms. And you're welcome to put questions in as we go through, and we can stop along the way and talk through everything as well. And for anyone that's watching the recording later, you're welcome to email us questions and give us a call on the phone. We're available to answer questions anytime Monday to Friday. So it's okay if you don't make it here in person to ask your question. So far, I'm not seeing questions. So I might just go ahead and share my screen and jump in, and we'll start talking about what the certification application looks like. So let me share my screen here.
Is it working? Yep, there we go.
Let me know if you see it. All
Yes.
right.
Yep, I see it.
Great. Yeah, so as Kim mentioned last week with the OCal certification, there's two main scopes of the certification. There's the cultivator scope and the manufacturer handler scope. So today we'll start by talking about the cultivator scope and go through some of those application forms. But if you're a manufacturer, we'll dive into those ones as well if we don't get to it today. So that'll be coming, and the forms are tailored to different types of operations, and there's multiple forms within the application. So we'll kind of talk through what you need to fill out and how it applies to what you're doing. So the first form that's in the application is the OCal certification contract. And this one is going to be for all operations. Everyone fills out this form, and it's mainly business information just to give us an idea of your business, what you do, kind of get to some key info. So as you see here, we've got the operation information, which asks for business name, address, tax ID, all the good details. And then moving on, section B, it talks about the operation summary. And this is where you give us an intro of what your operation does. Doesn't need to be super detailed, but it's good to give us an overview of your system, how you're growing, just something that the reviewer can look at and know what they're about to get into when they review your application. And then we have the contact information, which there'll be a primary contact on the certification, and you can also have additional contacts as well. So that would be anyone that you want to have involved in the certification that can access your organic system plan. They can make updates and changes to the certification. So it's good to have a few extra folks on there if you're working with a team and have multiple people that are going to need access to the certification. And feel free to stop me along the way if there's questions that I don't see popping up. So the next section asks about the certification program, whether you're doing OCal and non-OCal products, if you've had any other cannabis certifications, things like Sun and Earth or EnviroCan certification. You'll tell us about that here. And then just about the history of your OCal certification if you've been certified before. I'm assuming most of the folks here are probably going to be new to the certification. So we also ask about your cannabis licensing. So you'll tell us the details about your license type and who the licensee is. And there's different sections there depending on what type of operation you are. So this annual fee section, section F, is important. This is how we determine what your annual fee will be for the certification, and it's based on your OCal production value. So for starting line number 1, you'll put an estimated value of your OCal products over the next 12 months. So that would be an estimate of what you're going to grow in the next 12 months. What would be the dollar amount value for that product? And then if you're a cultivator, which is what we're focusing on today, we have line A here, and that's where you would put the expected cost of any OCal product that you're purchasing. So that would be any OCal certified seed or OCal certified planting stock, as well as if you work with any processors that are OCal certified doing OCal processing for you. You can also include the service fees that they charge you for that OCal product. And the way we calculate this fee is we take line 1, which is your total value of the product, and we subtract out line A, and that final amount is your OCal production value. And there's a tiered fee system that links in the program manual as well as on our website. And there's a starting level based on the OCal production value, and then it goes up in tiers from there. So depending on what level you're at, that's the fee that would correspond. And then if you were a manufacturer and not a cultivator, you can deduct out the cost of any OCal ingredients or products that you purchase. So that would be the difference in calculation if you're a manufacturer. And then this part is the certification contract itself, the formal contract. You'll have to sign this here. And to do the signature, it either needs to be a wet signature that you've written by hand. You can send us a photo or a scanned copy. Or you need to use a digital signature service, something like Adobe Sign or DocuSign. So those would be the 2 ways to sign this. If you do just a typed signature, it'll slow down the process a little bit because we'll send you a request for signature. So it's great if you can get one of those signature options ahead of time, keeps the process moving a little smoother. And then this is the last page on the certification contract here. The $350 application fee can be paid by credit card. You have the option to put your credit card information here on the application. Once we make that payment, we redact that information so your credit card information doesn't get stored. But if you prefer not to put your information onto the form itself, you can also pay the fee on our website, or you can mail a check to our office. So there's other options if you prefer not to put your credit card directly on the application forms. And then this last section here, public profile information. CCOF has an online directory, which is a great resource if you're interested in being listed. And so this is the information that will fill into your public profile once you become certified. And the online directory is a way for people to see that you're certified, as well as see what products you're certified for and what they're offering. So that's a good kind of marketing tool to have that online profile. Opens you up to some potential business opportunities if you put some good information on your public profile. All right, I see there's a message in the chat here from Maggie. Let me take a look at it. As a cultivator, if we certify our entire outdoor 10K outdoor garden, but probably can't sell everything through OCal channels, does that play into the certification fee? Yeah, so the way that fee is calculated here is it's your production value. So for example, if you're certifying the entire garden and whatever you produce in that certified area is what would be calculated for the certification fee. So if you don't necessarily sell it as OCal, but it's still OCal product that you produced on the certified OCal parcel, it would be included when you're calculating the total production value. If there's any particular hardship, if it's been a bad year, things didn't sell, or whatever the reason might be, you can always let us know if there's any particular challenges, if you didn't sell a significant amount of your product as OCal. It's possible that they can make exceptions certain years on your annual fees, but generally you're calculating the value of everything you're producing on your certified parcel, even if you're not necessarily selling that as OCal. Great question. All right. So that covers most of the certification contract. The only other section here at the end is if you happen to be interested in any of other CCOF's programs, you can tell us that here and we'll help get you set up as well. If you're doing crop production, aside from cannabis, things like vegetables, fruit, you can certify that to the USDA NOP standards as organic. We also have food safety services for non-cannabis products. There's Global Gap and Primus GFS food safety certifications. So if you have an interest in those, we can try our best to bundle inspections and kind of do a more holistic certification service that way. So if there's any more questions on the contract, now's a great time before we jump into the next form. All right, so this next form here in the application
Marli?
is, oh great, I see a question.
Yeah, there's
Awesome. From Devin, does the cost of organic amendments and nutrients go towards the cost of materials? No, any organic input materials you purchase are not part of that fee calculation. So here on line A, when you're making your deductions, it would only be OCal seed, OCal planting stock, or service fees charged by OCal processors. Any input materials, labor costs, equipment is excluded from this calculation. Great question. All right, so now we're here on the OCal Cultivator, the Guide to OCal Cultivator OSP forms. This is maybe the most important form in the whole application. It gives you orientation to what's in the application and whether those forms are going to be applicable to what you're doing. So this is a good place to start to get your feet under you as you're looking at the application, because there's a lot of forms and it can look overwhelming at the start. But if you go one by one and figure out what's going to be applicable for you, that'll help a lot with getting through it a little bit easier. So on the left-hand side, there's a column that gives a description about your activities. And then the right-hand side is what forms are applicable if you're doing those activities. So here on number 1 is the certification contract. That's what we just talked about. Everyone fills that one out. So that's starting point. And then under number 2 are the other forms that are required for everyone who's cultivating cannabis. These are the kind of general cultivator forms that cover different aspects of the cultivation process and are just kind of the key components of your OCal system plan. And then further down here on the list are some of the more specialized forms that don't necessarily apply to everyone, but potentially apply to what you're doing. So number 3, if you're using seed or planting stock, you'd want to fill out that form. Number 4, if you're doing any production in containers, or if you're doing production in a greenhouse, a shade house, or some kind of indoor building, you'd want to fill out that form. Then number 5, there's a form for compost and manure. So if you're using any sort of compost or manure products, you'd want to fill out that. And then after that, we've got storage form. If you have a storage on site where you're storing your products, you'll want to fill out the storage form. Then there's the simple post-harvest handling form. That would be for any simple handling you're doing yourself on the farm, and we'll get into detail of what that consists later on. But simple handling can be included in these cultivator forms. It's the more complex manufacturing activities that bump you into the other scope. if you are sourcing cannabis from other operations and then selling it, that also bumps you into the handler scope. So there's specific forms there, and we'll get into those later today or next week, depending. And then if you're working with an uncertified storage facility to store your cannabis products, you'll fill out this, or you'll have the storage facility fill out this affidavit. And then, as I mentioned before, processing cannabis into manufactured products bumps you into that handler scope. And then these last two forms are very infrequently used, but if you're doing production services for another CCOF operation, there's a contracted partner program. Then last one, number 12. If you're contracting other facilities, there's a harvest and transport form that might apply to some of that. So I see there's a few questions. Let me check in on those. All cultivators need to fill out number 3 or only if you use OCal. So anyone that's using seeds or planting stock needs to fill out number 3, the C 3.0, which does tend to be most operations, but it's broken out because there could be a few rare instances where it's not required. So that's why it's separated out from number 2, but most operations need to fill out number 3. If you do cover crop seed on your land as well, not necessarily just cannabis, but you'll tell us about your cover crop seed as well. And then a question from Devin. When the plants are immature and in a building, do we fill out Form 4? That's the container production. Yep. So if you have any portion of the production cycle happening inside of a greenhouse or indoors, you'll want to fill out this container greenhouse shade house form. And we're about to look into each of these in detail, so there might be more questions or clarification that come up as we get there. But are there any high-level questions about the forms now while we're here? All right, I'm going to carry on. So the first one here is the parcel application. This is where you'll tell us about your land and the history of your land. As we discussed last week in the initial session about some of the requirements to be OCal certified, the kind of basic requirement for your land is that there's at least 3 years without any prohibited materials being applied. So this is where you'll tell us about that. So it asks for information about the location, and then you'll tell us about the different strains that you're growing and how much of those you're growing. This next section here asks about your buffer zones and what kind of adjacent land use there is. If you have any non-OCal or non-organic neighboring land, you want to make sure that you have a buffer zone between your OCal production and those neighboring land uses so that there's no potential contamination from anything happening on that non-OCal area. So this is where you'll tell us about it. And then what? Okay, I see a few questions. Let me take a look. Is this beginner friendly? I would say the certification process itself does require a lot of work to fill out the forms and understand the requirements, but as long as you're meeting the standards, then anyone can get certified. And the applicant support team is here to help you get your application in order, answer questions as you get started. So we're definitely here to support you to make sure you understand the requirements and get a completed application submitted. And then once you submit your application, the reviewers give you feedback and they guide you through to make sure that any issues get corrected. So there's lots of opportunities for assistance and guidance along the way. There's also consultants that can do a little bit more hands-on support. They can be there to fill out the application for you. They can kind of give guidance on what you should do and that more hands-on consulting to help you with your practices. So that's another option if you need a little bit more hands-on assistance than what we're able to provide. Devin asked what buffer distance is. Go
So I'd
ahead.
mention something just to pop in for anybody that's located here in Nevada County. Through the Nevada County Cannabis Lines, we, if people do want a little bit more one-on-one support, anybody can come to the office here and we can help support you with your application. Just wanted to offer that too for the locals here. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great support. All right, I see another question from Devin. What buffer distance is required? Great question. There is no specific buffer distance requirement. It all depends on neighboring land use, the risk level, what the features, the natural features are of the buffer. I think generally I've heard 20 feet is a good number if you want to put a number on it. But if, let's say, for example, you have a conventional farm next to you that's spraying with airplane spraying, much higher risk of drift from a big aerial spray versus a conventional farm next to you that's doing backpack sprayers and just spraying very targeted areas. So with that in mind, depending on the neighboring land use, what materials they're using, if they're using any, a bigger buffer might be necessary in some cases. Or if there's limited risk, a smaller buffer could be all right. So that's kind of a risk assessment, and you'll tell us about the buffer. The reviewer will look at it to make sure that they think it's enough to mitigate the risk of contamination from neighboring areas. I also see you asked about offices in Arizona. The OCal certification program is only for cannabis in California, but CCOF does certify to the organic standard for non-cannabis all across North America. So while we're based in California, OCal certification is just in California. The organic non-cannabis certification does go across North America. All right. Moving on to the next section about maps. As part of your application, you'll include a map of your parcel, and this lists out some of the key components we're looking for on the map. We want to see the boundaries of the parcel clearly written out with the acreage on there. If you have any buildings or greenhouses, those types of things, you'd want to label all of that on your map. If you've got roads, you'll label the roads. Different types of production area within your operation, you'll want to label those on the map. And then the adjacent land uses that you mentioned above, you can write those out on the map as well as the buffer zones. And then any natural resources that are on the parcel as well. Things like waterways, woodlands, habitat, etc. And then that last one's a bit unique, the existing installations of treated lumber. Treated lumber is not allowed in organic or OCal certification, but if you have any existing installations of treated lumber, those are grandfathered in and they can remain. But when you replace them in the future or do any new installations, you're not able to use treated lumber. So on the map, we want to know where it is if you have it already. And then in the future, you're not able to replace or install new treated lumber. And we also, here where it says this CCOF documents page, We have a great parcel map guide that gives some examples too. So sometimes it's helpful to see an example. All right. This next section gets into the land history. So you'll tell us about when you began managing this parcel. All right, I see another question. Does that include a retaining wall in the driveway made with treated wood? So when you're certifying your parcel, you can include just your production area. So if there's a driveway that's outside the production area, you could exclude that from your certified parcel. Or if you are certifying that entire area where the driveway is present, then any existing installations of the wood would be allowed. So if it was in a retaining wall, that would be okay. But in the future, if you were to replace that and it's on your certified parcel, you would not be able to replace it with using any treated wood. But unless you're doing OCal production right up to where the driveway is, I'd say you could likely exclude the driveway from your parcel, and that would allow you the freedom to do those types of building needs without having the restrictions for treated lumber. All right, so back to this land history section. So it asks about when you began managing the parcel, whether it's currently certified, whether that's OCal with an OCal certifier like CCOF, or organic if it's under organic certification for other crop production. And then kind of the key piece of information it asks for here is your date of last prohibited material application. You have to have at least 3 years without any prohibited materials being applied. So this is where you'll tell us when you last applied them, and we'll make sure it's been at least 3 years since that date so that you're eligible for certification. And if you weren't the one managing it for the last 3 years, you'll tell us about who else has been managing it so that we can confirm the land history for that time. And you'll tell us about some of the production practices you've been doing. And then if there's any prohibited materials you've applied around the parcel, not necessarily in the parcel, but around it, you'll tell us about that as well. So when it comes to verifying that land history, the main way to do it is with a land history affidavit, which we provide here in the parcel application. And you'll fill it out for the time you've been managing the land. If that 3-year period, there were other managers of the land as well, you would provide the affidavit to them to fill out for their portion of the management of that 3 years. And you want to get the affidavits to cover that full 3 years to confirm that you're eligible for certification. Alternatively, if the operation is certified organic or certified OCal already, you can get a copy of their current organic certificate or OCal certificate to show that the land is eligible, and having some kind of verification that there was no lapse in certification is enough to confirm that. And then there's a few specific notes here about container systems. So if you're doing container production, you'll tell us about that here. So this is what the affidavit of land history looks like. And as I mentioned, you might have multiple of these if there's been multiple owners or managers over the past 3 years. But asks about the parcel, what was the time of management, and then you give a signature, and you're attesting that during that time, nothing prohibited was applied, and you'll tell us what was applied during that time. So here's the table of materials, and this is where you'll write out what materials you used during that management time. that you've listed out above. And so this serves as your attestation that nothing prohibited has been applied and that what you're writing here is true. And if you have a material list in a different format, you don't necessarily need to fill it out here in this table. You could always attach a separate list. Does anyone have any questions about the parcel application before we move on to the next one? Okay. Maggie asked, while our plants are in small pots until we transplant them out, does that qualify as container growing and in-ground growing? Yeah, if you're planting the small plants into pots, that would be considered container production. So I would still fill out some of the container forms. All right, move on to the next one here. I see seed trays. Yeah, you'll still want to tell us about that, because it is technically a container in the trays and then you're transplanting them. So you'll still want to tell us about that type of container production on the forms. All right, so now we're at the materials application. So in that last form, that table of materials on the land history affidavit was for the materials that were used during the time of management described on the affidavit. So moving on to this list, this is the materials that you're currently using and would like to use moving forward. And CCOF will review these materials and then, assuming they're all compliant with the standards, give you approval for those, and that is your official materials list of the materials that you're allowed to use. So you'll include the product name and the manufacturer name and what you use that product for. There's a few resources you have to help you with materials. Once you're certified, you get access to CCOF's material search, which is our internal online database of materials that other operations have used. But leading up to the certification, there's also OMRI, the Organic Material Review Institute, which reviews and approves materials. And then the WSDA, Washington State Department of Agriculture, also reviews and approves materials. And then I believe the CDFA has their own material review program as well, specifically for fertilizers. So those are a few resources as you're getting started looking for materials that are organic and OCal compliant. And then you'll put everything onto this list and CCOF reviews it to give a final confirmation. Kind of moving forward with the certification, you always want to add a material to your list and get it approved by CCOF before you use it to make sure you don't accidentally apply something prohibited. If that happened, if you did accidentally apply something prohibited, that sets you back and you have to go through the 3-year transition again. So it's best to get your materials reviewed ahead of time. All right. So any material type of questions? Here it's asking about specifically things like pest control, fertilizers, herbicides, compost, manure, seed treatments, those types of materials. Devin asks, is there a list of prohibited materials we can review? Yeah, the OCal Standards Manual has a list of what's prohibited, so we can share that with you. And then that would be the good starting point, and you can also see through OMRI or through CCOF's database what materials are prohibited as well. If there's a particular one you want to use, you can search it and see from there. All right. There's no more material questions. We'll move on to seeds and planting stock. All right, so here's the seeds and planting stock form that we talked about earlier. So the requirement is that you have to use OCal seed or OCal planting stock when it's available, which right now is not super widely available, but the idea is that you should first use your own OCal grown seeds and planting stock or OCal seeds and planting stock from an OCal certified nursery. If you can't do that, if it's not commercially available, you have to show us that you looked for an OCal version first, and then when you couldn't find it, you used a non-OCal version as long as it wasn't treated. So here on section A, you'll tell us about what kind of seeds you're sourcing and what kind of planting stock you're sourcing. And then if you're doing anything like cover cropping, you'd also want to look for organic seed if you can. If you can't find it, non-GMO and untreated is okay. And then here, this commercial availability section is where you'll tell us about why you couldn't source an OCal variety if you weren't able to find one. So commercial availability is the ability to obtain the seed or planting stock in the form, quality, and quantity needed for your system. Price is not a factor in that determination. So if the OCal version is out there, it's just a little more expensive. That is not considered as part of the commercial availability search, but things like form, quality, and quantity are. So this is where you'll tell us about if you had to use a non-OCal seed, what qualities it is that you look for, why you had to use that non-OCal version, and then kind of the standard when checking commercial availability is you would want to look for at least 3 suppliers to see if the OCal cannabis seed or stock is available. And if not available with 3 suppliers, you would demonstrate that search, and then it would be okay to use the non-OCal version. And CCOF does provide a sample form on our website that serves as a commercial availability search form. So that can help you with structuring your commercial availability search so you have the information to show the reviewer and the inspector to confirm that you did search for the OCal version but weren't able to find it. All right, so here's mention of genetic modification. GMOs are prohibited. Same goes for both for the OCal planting stock and seed as well as any cover crop seed. So both of those, no GMOs, no prohibited seed treatments. You'd want to check with who you're sourcing from to make sure nothing you're purchasing is GMO. And if you do seed and planting stock treatments, you would need to make sure they are approved for your use, and you'd tell us about what the treatment is. So that's something you should put in the material list we just looked at, and then here you'll tell us about that. And the last one asks about grafting. I'm not sure how common that is, but if you do grafting, you'll tell us about it here. Maggie asked if I've been growing my own genetics and there's an OCal strain of the same name, does that mean I can't use my own genetics anymore? So one of the kind of parts of commercial availability is that the seed or planting stock is in the form or quality that you need. So if you've been growing something yourself, you have unique genetics that are well suited to your land, to your region, to your specific microclimate, that could be a valid reason of why you want to use your own non-OCal version compared to an OCal version. So you would tell us about that here, about why the specific form or quality of your seed is different and unique to the OCal version that is available. And the reviewer will look at that and make that final determination. But if the form or quality is unique to your operation, then that would be sufficient usually to be allowed to use the non-OCal version. Any more seed or planting stock questions while we're here? If that crop of yours then gets OCal certified, the next year your own seeds and clones from that certified crop would be considered certified going forward. Yep, that's correct. So once you're OCal certified, if you're saving seeds or doing clones from your own OCal certified crops, then those would be OCal seeds and clones, which solves your commercial availability issues for the future. Also, you could then market those as OCal seed and OCal planting stock if you wanted to sell them as well. All right, carrying on with the next form. This is the container and greenhouse shadehouse production form. So this is what will cover any type of container production or production not taking place in the ground, as well as if you're doing production in a greenhouse, shadehouse, or indoors. All right. So this first section, you'll tell us about the production type and where you're doing it. And you'll also tell us about where you're growing. So this container production or wherever you're growing things in a structure needs to be part of your parcel that's certified. So if your greenhouse is on a separate parcel or the building that you're growing in is separate from the parcel you're certifying, you also need to submit a parcel application for that area. So here you'll tell us about if you're using any sort of growing media like substrate or planting mix, potting soils. Those types of things are going to be on the materials application we looked at a few forms ago. And you'll want to make sure that any growing media you're using is organic compliant or OCal compliant. And some of those will have OMRI listings. Others, CCOF can review for you if it doesn't have an external listing, but you'd want to make sure that there's no prohibited materials in any of the substrate or growing media that you're using. And it also asks about how you're irrigating to prevent contamination for the surrounding environment. And then if you're doing OCal cannabis that's grown to maturity or harvest in containers, there's a little bit of extra information you'll provide about your system. Things like photographs, you'll tell us a little more detail about your system. So if that's the type of production you do, a little bit more detail is requested here. And then this section C is asking about if you're also, so this is asking about if you're doing production in greenhouse, shadehouse, or buildings. And then if you're doing conventional production in those same buildings as well. So the main concern here is to make sure there's no possible commingling or contamination of OCal and non-OCal products. So if you're a split operation that's doing both OCal and non-OCal and in the same building, you'd want to have really clear signage to identify OCal and non-OCal production areas and minimize any possible risks of commingling or contamination. All right. Section D asks about alternating production. I believe this would be when you're alternating OCal and non-OCal production in the same area, which is probably unlikely, but if you do that, you need to have pretty good systems in place to make sure there's no commingling. And so this is kind of you developing your plan for how you're going to prevent commingling and contamination in that type of production system. And if you don't do that type of production, you can skip this section. Any questions about shade houses, greenhouses, container production? And the only unique thing I'll add on about production inside of buildings is if you are doing production in, for example, a greenhouse or shade house that has a permeable floor, like a dirt floor or some kind of plastic covering that water could get through if there were holes in it, those types of systems need to meet the 3-year land transition requirement. And that's a certified parcel that needs to meet that 3 years. If your production is in a building that has concrete floors, a fully covered and closed roof, those types of buildings with impermeable floorings do not need to meet the 3-year land history requirement, the same way that a permeable flooring greenhouse, shade house structure would. So there are questions that ask about that in the parcel application as well as here, but I wanted to call that out specifically. If you're fully indoors with a concrete flooring and a roof over your head, then you don't have to meet that same 3-year transition timeline. All right. Devin asked if we grow vegetables or fruit trees in the certified area now or in the future, will those products also be certified by OCal? No. So any non-cannabis production that you're doing in the certified area would not be included. OCal is only for the cannabis production that you're doing. If you wanted to make an organic claim on those vegetables or fruits, you could also certify to the USDA NOP organic standard, which is structured almost identically as OCal. The application looks quite similar. The requirements are very similar. And you could do that with CCOF and have one bundled inspection together, but it is still a separate program. So there are separate organic system plan, separate certification fees that would be paid to have the vegetables and fruit certified organic. If you were just doing OCal program, it would only be the cannabis getting certified. All right, I'll carry on here. This next form is the rotation and soil management form. So this is going to ask you about how you're managing the nutrients and soil fertility on your system. Those would be things like cover cropping, doing some kind of rotation, hedgerows, those types of things. So the first section here, you'll talk about your crop rotation. If you're growing in ground, you'll tell us about what your plan is for crop rotation. And the goal is to maintain or improve the soil organic matter content and avoid depleting the plant or avoid depleting the nutrients in the soil, control erosion, as well as mitigate pest concerns through that rotation. And then if you do container production, there are still some requirements for soil management in the areas around your container production. So you'll tell us about that. And it's going to ask you about what your soil fertility and nutrient management plan is. We give you some check boxes here that are common practices, but if you do anything besides this, you can explain it there. And if you're using any input materials that are specific for soil fertility, those should be on the material list that we looked at earlier. And then if you're doing any sort of tillage or unique cultivation practices, you can tell us about that here. Section B asks about what your plan is to manage or to monitor the management of the soil. Those could be things like monitoring soil organic matter content or doing yield comparisons, looking at the health of the plant, those types of things. So you'll tell us about what factors you look for to monitor how well your soil fertility is doing and what kind of the way your plan is performing. If you do any sort of soil testing, tissue testing, or microbiology testing, you'll tell us about that here as well. And if you do those types of tests, when you have your inspection, the inspector will probably want to take a look at some of those to see what your soil fertility is looking like. And the last section is about erosion control. The goal is to prevent and minimize erosion. So we give you some examples of practices that are common to do that. But if you do something different that's helping with erosion, you can explain it there as well. Right, moving on. We've got compost and manure form here. So this is one of those optional forms. If you're not using compost or you're not using manure, you don't need to complete this one. But if you do use either of those types of products, you'll want to fill this one out. And you should list those materials in the materials list. Common theme. You want everything in the materials list. And then if you're producing these yourself, like a compost or vermicompost, compost tea, if you're doing any of those yourself, you'll tell us about how you produce it. And then down here, the section about manure. There's some specific requirements about manure that you'll have to meet. So if you're putting raw manure onto the production area, you want to make sure that you're incorporating it into the soil at least 90 days before the harvest of cannabis. That's consumable portions don't contact the soil, which I may be wrong, but I think most cannabis, the consumable portion is not contacting the soil. But if there is portions that are harvested that do contact the soil, you want to incorporate the manure at least 120 days before the harvest of that. And then crops that aren't for human consumption don't have those same time frame requirements. If there's any questions about compost and manure, this one's pretty short form. But if you are doing your own compost, there's some specific requirements to consider it as compost, if you're doing compost with manure. So that's called out specifically in the form. All right, we're on the natural resources form now. Another key component of the OCal and the organic programs are maintaining or improving the natural resources on your land. So that would be things like the physical, hydrological, or biological features of the operation. So here you'll tell us about what kind of natural resources you have on the land. Those could be things like rivers, bodies of water, habitat areas, specific wildlife that you see, kind of whatever your ecosystem looks like on your farm. And then asks about conservation plan. Next asks about your water resources. So what are you doing to maintain or improve your water resources? We give you some examples here, but you might be doing more than that, something different than that, so you can always describe more. And then the same as improving or maintaining natural resources, doing things to improve wildlife areas, kind of leave some habitat on the farm. Those are all great practices, and you'll tell us about it here. And it also asks about managing habitat for pollinators and other wildlife. So those might be through hedgerows, or you could have bird boxes, bat boxes. Yeah, you'll tell us more about how you're managing the habitat there. And then it's asking about what action you take to prevent or control invasive plant or animal species. So if you do have invasive species on your parcel, you'd want to do your best to control them or prevent them altogether. So there's some options here. And then if you're restricting wildlife from entering the production area, you might want to do some other kind of wildlife habitat in another area of your parcel or surrounding area to mitigate the loss of wildlife habitat. So there's options here of what could be some things you do. And then if you're an indoor production doing greenhouse or some other indoor type of facility, you do still have to meet these natural resource requirements, but there's some more unique ways you can do that. Things like water conservation, energy conservation, recycling. Those are ways that an indoor production operation might still be able to meet the standards. And you'll want to have a plan for monitoring the biodiversity and natural resources. So there's lots of ways you can do that. I think photography logs or some kind of wildlife log is common. Observations in a journal, doing different testing. Those are all options. If you have livestock present on your land, there's a whole section related to conservation when livestock are involved in the system. If you don't have livestock, you can skip that section. But there's some kind of extra considerations to take when there's livestock on the property. So that's it for natural resources. Moving on to pest management. Let's see, Devin asked, are a goose and 2 ducks considered livestock? Yep, goose and the ducks would be considered livestock. Now, if they have access to the production area, you would likely want to complete this section here, conservation involving livestock. But if they're kind of outside the OCal production system, not actively in the certified parcel, then I would consider that there's no livestock on the parcel. And I think a goose and 2 ducks are less detrimental than other larger livestock animals. So the pest management form, this first one, it gives a variety of strategies that you can use to prevent or control pests. And you don't need to do all of these things. You might only do a few of them. We give you some options and you check off which boxes you do. And if there's other things you do, you can tell us more detail later in the form. But the goal is that you're starting off by doing preventative management practices before you start using input materials to control pests. So first you'd want to do some of these preventative practices. And then if those don't work and you do need to use other materials for controlling weeds, insects, or diseases, you'd list it on your materials application and you'll describe why you're using it. And this last section here is about crop residues. Generally, burning is not allowed as a way of disposing of crop residues, but there are some allowances if it's for disease suppression or stimulating seed germination. So if you do burn crop residues, you'll want to tell us about it here to make sure that it's meeting the standards. All right, moving on to this production form. First section talks about buffer zones, which we talked about a little bit in the parcel application, but you do need to have a buffer area. If your buffers are small and you're not able to get a big enough buffer to meet the standards, minimize the risk of contamination, there's some other things you can do, such as having a buffer crop. So this talks about some of that and what you're doing to prevent contamination. So that might be posting signs around the borders of your parcel. You might be communicating with your neighbors about your OCal production and minimizing contamination. Those are all some common things. Split production would be if you're doing OCal and non-OCal production. If you don't do that, you can skip this section, but if you do split production, you need to have things clearly labeled so you know what's OCal and what's not. And then the lumber treated with prohibited materials is here. This is where you'll tell us if you have any existing installations. And then it describes that if you install anything new, you're not able to use that treated lumber. Section D, you'll tell us about the production equipment. So this will be any type of equipment that you're using for input material application, seeding, planting, harvesting, all of that. Tell us about that there. Devin asked, if you use gopher cages, should you note that in materials for controlling pests? That's a great question. I would probably describe that in one of this other option here. It's not something you're directly doing to the pest, but it's something you're implementing to prevent them. So I think that's a good thing to describe there. And if there's not a spot for it, you can put it in the other section. After equipment, we have irrigation. You'll tell us what the source of your water is. Hopefully there's no prohibited materials in it. You'll tell us if you know of any in it. And then if you do shared irrigation lines with any other crops, any other production nearby, you'll want to make sure that there's no prohibited materials being applied into that shared irrigation line that could then get on your OCal certified parcel. And this asks about prohibited materials on the farm. If you're storing prohibited materials on the farm, you want to make sure it's all clearly labeled, no potential for mixing it up. This 6.1 form is for harvest and transport. So if you're responsible for harvesting, you would fill this out. It would be the OCal operation. The OCal certified operation has to have those records. If you contracted an uncertified company for harvest, you would tell us about that here. And then if you're responsible for transport as well, or if another operation is doing transport, tell us about that. And we ask about what type of equipment you're using for harvest and transport. If you have any cleaning materials, you'll want to list that on your materials list. And this last section here is about any post-harvest handling or processing at another operations location. So if you're doing processing yourself, or if you're doing processing yourself, you can skip this section. If you're doing processing at another facility, but you still retain ownership of the product, that's when this section would be applicable. So here we have the storage form. If you're storing your product on site, you would fill this out. And then if you're contracting another storage facility, you would also want to tell us who you're contracting storage at. And if they're uncertified, they complete that uncertified handler affidavit. And it'll tell us about storage facilities. And when you have a storage facility, if you're storing both OCal and non-OCal product in that same storage area, you want to have clear labeling in place to make sure there's no commingling of the products, that things don't get mixed up. And then if you're doing any pest control in your storage facility, you'll add those pest control materials to your material list. And ideally, you would prevent the pests in the first place, and you'll tell us about that. But if you need to use materials, that's when you would list it on your material list and have it reviewed. All right. This one is the simple on-farm post-harvest handling. So like I mentioned at the start when we were looking at the guide, there's some simple handling activities occurring on the farm that can be included here with the cultivator forms. And then the more complex manufacturing and off-farm activities then get bumped into the handler manufacturer scope. So here for the simple on-farm activities has to be happening on the farm, as the title suggests. And that would be things like drying, curing, grading, trimming, rolling, packaging, labeling, simple things that you're doing just to the flower. No multi-ingredient products, no kind of further processing, just those simple activities. So if you do any of that sort of handling, you'll tell us about it here, and you'll list where the facility that it's happening at, how you're cleaning your equipment. Any cleaning materials get listed on that materials list from earlier. And then you'll tell us about your packaging, what kind of packaging materials you use. And then there's a few extra forms if you're doing pre-rolls and it has flour and the keef, there's an extra form to complete from the handler forms. And then doing any sort of non-cannabis ingredients in pre-rolls, also bumps you into that handler category, starts to get into the complex handling. So those get called out here if you need it. All right, we're nearing the end of the application for cultivators. This is good. So now we're on the labeling form. There's two parts here. There's non-retail and there's retail. For non-retail containers, those would be things for shipping or storing the OCal products. You need to have some labeling on the containers, and this is where you'll tell us about it. So it asks what kind of containers you're using and how you're identifying the OCal status of the product, and then what kind of lot numbering or traceability numbering is on those containers. And then for retail packaging, you're going to submit samples of retail labels that you want to put on the products if you're using those. And the statements you can say are certified OCal by CCOF, and we have CCOF logo, OCal logos for you to use. And then you submit those labels to CCOF to be reviewed. You'll also submit examples of your non-retail container labels as well. All right, the last form in the application is record keeping. And so in this form, it covers some of the common record keeping documents you might have, but it's up to you to figure out what system works best and what documents fit well for your production system. But you should have records that cover the production, the harvest, and the handling of your products. And there should be traceability from the time you plant something to the time it's harvested and then sold. So this table here is a good resource just to take a look based on what activities you do. It gives examples of common records you might use. And then this next section asks for a sample audit trail. So that's going to be the set of documents from harvest through sale of the product that traces it back. So you'll give an example of those. It might be something like a harvest log, packing log, and then sales record, transportation record, something like that. But it can depend. Does our metric record serve as a method for traceability? I'm not familiar with metric, but there are a lot of softwares out there that do record keeping. So if metric is a software that you use for your record keeping and document management, then that likely will serve as good. And you'll show it to the inspector. You'll give examples here with your application. So if we have questions about the documents, or if it looks like you're missing something or you need more to your system, they'll give you that feedback. And if you do both OCal and non-OCal production, there's a little bit of extra questions here just to make sure it's really clear what's OCal and what's not OCal, both product labeling wise, but also on all your sales documents, on all your traceability records, storage, signage. You want to have that really clear. So we've reached the end of the OCal cultivator application. I know that was quite lengthy, but as you go through the forms, questions are pretty self-explanatory, and we're here to support you if you don't understand anything in the application or if you're not sure whether a form applies to what you're doing. So we can always talk through questions with you if you need. But in the meantime, are there any more questions? We've got a few minutes left in the call. Happy to answer more while we're all here. And these are recorded, so you can always come back to it while you're filling out the application if you want to look back and focus in on a specific form. So that's also a great idea.
Yeah, that's what I came on here to say. I'm wrapping up for Diana. Thank you so much, Marli. That was awesome. This feels like a lot of information on its own, but with you guys here, it feels like very doable. So like Marli said, this recording will be available on our Get Legit YouTube channel, which I'll be posting probably sometime next week. It'll be in our newsletter, and on our Instagram, which we mentioned in the beginning. So check us out at Nevada County Alliance, and you can find all the recordings posted for webinar 1 and 2. And then next week is webinar number 3, which is on May 21st. And then the last one is May 28th, the 4th and final webinar of this OCal webinar series. So thanks for pushing through this one. This is all really great information, and we're just so grateful to have you guys. So thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining. Send questions our way, and you can join on next week and ask us live too. So
Yeah, what is
thanks.
it? Get certified at CCOF?
Our
.org?
email is getcertified@ccof.org. And then I can also put our phone number in there too if you prefer to chat with us. It's 831-423-2263. And our team reaches directly if you hit option 1.
That is very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to
Yeah,
copy
of
that.
course.
Copy that so I can put that in the information on the that's really cool. Okay, cool. Well,
Perfect.
thanks again, Marli, and everyone that joined us today, and we will see you next week. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.